Hello, everyone. My name is Brigitte Farah. I'm from the Metallurgy and Materials Society of CIM. Thank you for joining us today. The webinar is entitled Mining, Ecological Engineering, and Metals Extraction for the 21st Century. It's presented by Margarete Kalin, Research Director and President of Boojum Research Limited. Before we begin, I just want to take you through a few housekeeping notes. So if you dialed in with your computer audio, ensure that the radio button is selected for computer. And likewise, if you chose the traditional telephone, that the phone call button is selected. Throughout this webinar, if you have any questions, just type them in the control box that you see here, and we'll be collecting them for the Q&A at the end of the session. If you have a technical question, type it in as well, and I'll address that as soon as I can. We also have some handouts available. So again, look on your control panel. You should see 2 handouts available. And we'll be doing some poll questions throughout this session. So I hope that you will enjoy. I am not by myself today. I'm joined by Nolene Ahern of Bear Gold Corporation. She's the former chair of the METSOC Environmental Technical Section. And of course, we have our esteemed panelist, Margarete Kalin. So without further ado, I'm going to make my colleague the presenter. And Margarete, you can begin.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brigitte and Neolin. And welcome, everyone. I'm glad we are a reasonably big group of presently 42. And I hope that some of you have listened to the previous webinars. And I wanted to point out to you that we are the last in this METSOC environmental section webinars. One was Mining Value from Waste program by Janice Sink, highlighted the value of environmental hazards whereby David Cutcherville. And finally, the third one was an outline measures in mining to reduce water consumption by Laurie Riemeyer. I will now start the webinar, but it's clear, I listened yesterday to the CIMIC webinar, and it appeared, I had to point that out, that would be worthwhile listening to too, that the objectives of what we have presented from the environmental section fit very well into the CIMIC goals. My presentation, however, does not present anything new, but I hope with this summary of our company's R&D work on ecological processes, we managed to follow the KISS principles in the write-up. KISS principles, you know, keep it simple, stupid, which was requested by Oxford. It had to be written in plain language. Next slide. In the section of environmental issues and problems, I found contributions of well-known ecologists. And, you know, I realized, man, I really have done nothing else, which is basic ecology of extreme ecosystems, because this is what these waste piles are. This needed somewhat a perspective for the reader, because most people think, so what, this is ground up rock and a bit of sand. So I asked colleagues of mine to contribute to give a perspective on the resource consumption of water and land, and also present more effective mineral extraction. The three of us realized the need of a paradigm shift in thinking. As Einstein put it, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Along with the other 3 webinars, we have provided, hopefully, a bit of a direction how to. Next slide. Oxford laid out the framework which I needed to follow, and it started with, how did you discover what you've done? Well, how did I get into this? After my master's at the University of Toronto, I organized at the Institute of Environmental Studies a 4-year investigation addressing the pathways of long-lived radionuclides and the ecological behavior of uranium mill tailings. Because the concern was great that we are all glowing in the dark. This was how many years back that was. The radionuclides did not contaminate the food chain. However, I needed to work with the mining companies in Elliott Lake in order to get access to the sites, because they were at the time restricted to the public. And they pointed out to me that there's a much more severe problem and said, Kalin, why don't you do something sensible with your solids? Stop the lime trucks. Well, after 35 years of work on waste rock and tailings piles in many places of the world, I think that Boojum has provided the foundation of a sustainable approach, which we can apply from the cradle to the grave. We should no longer need lime trucks if it's really as successful implemented as I think it is possible. Hence, we aimed at an in situ approach, ecological and sustainable. Please note my underlined within the waste and not afterwards. Today, after many years, we know enough about these processes in order to state that from the cradle to the grave is indeed a possibility. The next slide. Here I show I can only show brief insights. What we discovered again and again as we were working or inspecting the uranium mill tailings, nature's attempt to fix itself in some location. In the root zones, we often measured higher pH than in barren areas. So the root zones were actively altering the area around the roots. On the left-hand picture, you see the investigations we carried out. We dug around in many places in Elliott Lake, Bancroft, and other places, also in Saskatchewan, determining of the differences in chemical physical characteristics between barren and gross areas. Now, when I mean gross areas, please note the fat arrow that points out in a huge big area of nothing growing, aspen trees, and the slim arrows, there's a little bit of something dark. You notice that is moss, lichens growing there. And again, that's where we derive the characteristics, the physical exposure, wind erosion, etc., in these kind of locations. The right-hand picture is digging into pyrrhotite tailings, about 20 years old, 45% pyrite and 5% pyrrhotite. And we noticed this pattern, brown stripes, and then completely non-oxidized areas, layers in between. The relevant information is that also a tailings pond or a waste rock pile is not a homogeneous mass, but it has in different locations different degrees of oxidation. One of the remarkable things we noticed, a moss cover, for example, is acting like a sponge. It keeps the water in the roots for the dry summers and acts like a consumption for heterotrophic microorganisms which are consuming oxygen. So it this type of pattern could be simulated if we promoted moss. So one of the experiments we did was experimenting with moss covers or introducing moss covers, which is not that difficult. Next slide, please. Well, that is all about what you're going to hear from me today in terms of experimentation. What did we do about contaminated larger water bodies, like settling ponds, and in which often flocculating agents are used? In all wastewater, which we looked for life, we discovered quite not a very large or very dense, a very high population of organisms, but there was always somebody growing. And these organisms, they are acting like flocculating agents. Where did I find that out? From the literature, from the scientific literature. So what we needed to do is to generate algal blooms. This is achieved by either adjusting the nutrient imbalances, which are always present, or by gradually raising the pH. And that you do with magnesium scrap suspended on barges. We tried with liming, but what happens with liming, you basically sterilize the water because you kill all of the critters present with the pH shock. It goes much too fast. It's the first order reaction. So you see these, basically these are the opposite of what you are driving around in the middle of your tires, whatever these things are called. On alkaline tailings, on the right side of the slide, you see one person holding up something which looks like, I don't know, like a curtain. These are algae, macrophytic algae, growing in Timmins and are loaded up the biomass with nickel. In Cameco, we found algae, also macrophytic algae, the attached algae. Radium and uranium is taken out of the water. So these algae grow on top, consume oxygen, and decay at the bottom, forming a metal-rich sediment where microbes, other microbes then biomineralize and stabilize the metals. Well, what is happening? Did we skip a slide? I think so, but that's okay. Next slide. What are you on now? You see a natural, these ones, they are good, thank you. So what is the end point of such a water body or an open pit or ditches in an operation? Clearly, we want to keep the wastes in reducing conditions. So we need a lid on the ponds, which supply organic carbon to microbial active sediments to reduce the oxygen. The upper part of this picture is a natural landing in, or a process which is called terrestrialization, changing the land. So this is the beginning of a floating muskeg. And the lower picture is what we induced. In progress in the lower part is one of our R&D sites in Northern Ontario, where this brown stuff is the mill pond with 3,000 milligrams per liter of zinc, and from a small waste rock pile. And you can see in the receiving ponding and drainage, we started the process with cut brush tolerant moss, and we fertilized the sediment. Next slide. Everyone is interested in costs, and this goes relatively as an easy one. Please compare the algal polishing pond and the high density treatment plant. Cost estimates were provided by Mike Sudbury, he is a retired executive of former Falconbridge, now Xstrata or Glencorn. He visited many of the Boojum R&D sites. He compared the biological polishing process to a high-density treatment plant. I believe the cost savings are evident. Next slide, please. So what is this ecological engineering? It's no mystery. It's put the word ecological and engineering together. So you proceed like an engineer, but with the background that you want to design an ecosystem which serves benefit for humans, which means controls pollution in our case, and also beneficial to nature. So a clearer effluent quality would be released from the mining waste, tailings, and waste rock piles. We know that the cover alone controls the erosion on tailings, but waste rock piles, they are leaking at one point in time, if they have a cover or not, and most certainly at one point they might be starting to steam and cook. These type of waste rock piles are a recent concern of INAP. And sorry to tell you, microbes are at work there too. There are thermophiles there. And I think now we are up to the first poll question, so you don't fall asleep.
Yes,
Bridget.
I will launch this. One moment, please. Here we go. Which factors are the most important to understand in ecological engineering of mine wastes? This is the question for the audience to respond. Extreme ecosystem status, multidisciplinary, natural repair processes. So I'll give you the audience a few minutes to vote, a few seconds. Okay, 30% voted, 40. Let's see where it goes. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think everybody voted. And here are the results. So 53% said natural repair processes. Back to you, Margarete.
Well, I think you've listened very good. Thank you very much. I'm pleased. Now I will go on about the most, let's say, the most important achievement from my perspective we at Boojum, with many people together, have achieved. The picture you see right now, it's the very first site pyrrhotite covered, and that was where this person stands, is where we did the very first experiments with how to construct the sediment, which I think that slide slipped by. Microbes live in biofilms. So you're now on the next slide with the site of the problem and therefore the site of the solution. Thank you. Microbes live in biofilms, and biofilms are basically like mats, and they stick to the minerals. Microbes which live in biofilms on rocks, they derive energy in corrosion pits on mineral surfaces after physical and chemical weathering has made the surface of the mineral acid. So the logical thing is to, if you want to stop this activity, which I've highlighted in red in the slide, the increase in rate of oxidation is 1,000-fold. So it's logic, if we would manage to inhibit these buggers, which produce the trouble, that we should be one very great step ahead. Now, how could we get them to stop? By the process on how we end up with the contaminated seepage, namely the rainwater. So we have to get some substance which is producing small enough particles that they get carried away with the rain. And what we looked in the literature, there were a group of US workers which were working with carbonaceous phosphate mining wastes, which I will call later on CPMW to make it shorter. They were added to outdoor coal piles, and these produced intriguing results. They considered it should be a stoichiometric reaction, and the whole thing was dropped. There was a big time where everyone thought we could make coatings of iron around the rock. However, the lowest dosage added was the best effluent which emerged from these test piles. Then, in the mining, a little bit later, in the mining journal, shareholders were upset that the heap leach did no more produce any copper. However, we were very happy because this was just an event which we thought was brought about by microbes. So we got some rocks from that section of the heap leach and some money from NRC to look at the surface of the rocks. You see one of these rocks, which we got shipped in the slide. Indeed, a lot of microbes and a lot of precipitated iron hydroxide, which had sealed the copper underneath, which was supposed to be leached. Next slide. So we set up experiments, once again, always the same story. On the left side, you see the balcony of our office in Toronto. And on the right side, you see, you have a look into one of the drums after we had monitored for 2.5 years. You see those brown grains? These are well, obviously in the beginning they aren't brown, but that is the beginning of the acid mine drainage in the drums, and the stuff got coated with iron. But the interesting part was that the amount we added to a drum was more than 50%, was 8 liters per drum. That's 8 liters per 70 kilos, no, 70 liters of waste rock. But we recovered about 5 liters of the material added. So we were hoping, this was our hypothesis, that we let small grains to carry to the mineral surface with the water, and hopefully the microbes which were colonizing the gravel of the CPMW, they would be overtaking, hopefully, the acid-loving microbes. Fight a bug with a bug was the idea. Next slide. Here are the results of the first 2.5 years. This is the upper graph. The addition produced clear effluent. You can see the lower graph is the control, no NPR or no CPMW added, and the two upper ones one was mixed application and one was layered. This was basically to simulate conditions with, if you would drive over with this gravel of each lift on a waste rock pile. The differences aren't very, between the two applications are minute, are insignificant, but the difference with control is large. So once we had these results, I thought the industry would really get excited. Well, I think the opposite occurred, and most thought, or I suspect many thought, this woman has gone nuts. You can't inhibit acid mine drainage. And if she hasn't got nuts, she's got some screws loose. We obtained funding from the Ontario. However, we were very happy. We obtained funding from the Center of Excellence in Ontario and sufficient to support a postdoc at the University of Ottawa. The researchers confirmed indeed that a biofilm had formed. So what did I do? On the one hand, I was very happy because my hypothesis seemed to come to fruition. However, I realized that nobody would believe me if I did not prove that this film would last, and even I wasn't sure. So from the functioning, from the science point of view, yes, the biofilm is going to be a very stable structure, as we know from the corrosion studies. It was clear that the biofilm is very stable. So what did I do? Well, what do good scientists do? They repeat the experiments and give material to other scientists to repeat the work with CPMW. So the university in Germany in Germany received CPMW and did a PhD with it. Rocks from the experiments were sent, from the drum experiment, were sent for more detailed service investigations. We only looked at it with SEM, and in Ottawa they did more sophisticated work, but they had even a better microscope, and the rocks became part of an Amira project at the University of Western Australia. And let me tell you, they tried everything that my CPMW was not going to work. They tested us with red dog mining waste, but the experimental setup, well, I had no control over it. I didn't like it. We had material shipped while all these surface investigations were going on, we had material shipped in trainloads to all clients we developed decommissioning scenarios for, which you can now find in the Laurentian Library. We sampled the field tests for 2, and you'd heard correctly, trainloads of this gravel. So we could set up large enough field tests, which we sampled 2 to 5 years later. And in the lab, we tried to make acid as much as possible, but the whenever presence of CPMW was measured, effluents were drastically improved. This is also what I did with the graph below post-storage, and they were 4.5 years, and with the rest, I didn't ship masses of rocks, I had enough. I put them outside in the back of a parking lot until I had to move them behind in my garden in the house because the superintendent complained. And we tried to make acid. We let the rainwater accumulate in the drums. We drained them, we measured it. And you can see in the lower graph, we were not successful in killing and disintegrating the biofilms on the surface of the rocks. Next slide. But we had engaged 15 authors, 8 organizations, 8 types of mining waste. With each publication, we got closer documenting the original hypothesis. But this is not the slide which should be on, it should be the one before. But all what happened, it got more and more difficult to get funding. So it appeared clear that a good effluent was not good enough. Each time, more questions from mining people at conferences. I realized basically it is impossible to overcome the perception that AMD and ARD is part of the business of doing mining. And obviously, maybe my previous suspicion was somewhat contributing to the absence of interest too. I still have some rocks today, and from the second outdoor exposure, we had to identify the microbes. Now, that slide, which you see now, is the final proof. We have here percentage of neutrophilic. The gray ones are the neutrophilic heterotrophs. The blue ones are the chemophilic heterotrophs. These were making acid. And you can see when there was no NPR, with NPR and no NPR was appropriate, a very, very high population of neutrophilic acidified. Somehow that color scheme did not match with the curves. We had to wait for the 40 days in order to not give up. And I tell you, when I saw how these leaching biofilm centers started at pH 1.5, I thought, okay, that's it, forget it. Now comes the next slide with the bottles. We leached it for 203 days, and you can clearly see when the NPR was there, the effluent is clear, the pH is up, and the conductivity, redox is down, and the conductivity is remarkably reduced, because conductivity, of course, is iron and sulfate producing. Now, you may not think 2.1 is much, but please remember it's the negative log of a hydrogen ion concentration. Next slide. So what you will find in the oops, it didn't. What you will find is in the Oxford. How did I get? I got an invitation to the Oxford to contribute, and this forced me to distill the essentials of ecological engineering down to really clearly to the essentials. It became clear in this process the simplicity of the approach, fundamentally the same, albeit somewhat different at each site, as the chemical and physical conditions differ, but the recovery processes, they don't. Viewed in retrospect, they were the same. Hence, we have approached the mine site just the same as any other engineering process. First of all, you don't need to add any extra space. You don't need to add any bugs. You provide better growth conditions and structures to adjust the nutrient imbalances. So you have a site assessment, and this is just like going to a phase 2 feasibility. That's a combination of lab and field tests. And phase 3 is a field pilot, and then you derive design criteria for the scale up. So that's the similarity to engineering, hence ecological engineering. Next slide. How do you put it all together? At the end of phase 2, when that looks positive, you put all the processes together in a treatment train or a recovery train. Here, an overview how processes are integrated with sediment stabilization, an underwater meadow in the lake. This is Boomerang Lake, which you see, and precipitate with phosphate, that is the sediment stabilization. And outflow, in the outflow, we established aerum and biological polishing stimulated with the magnesium barges. And this site is the 45% pyrite and 5% pyrrhotite. And I tell you, it was like a fire breaking out each and every time. There was a groundwater seepage from the tailings, which you can see there. It's about 1 million tons of tailings at the end of this other lake, which got contaminated over one winter. with the seepage, groundwater seepage. So we did basically we adjusted Aeron by simulating adding organics into an artesian well to hope to precipitate underground, form a new ore body. Well, and what did we do on the tailings? We added again CPMW in the hope that we could develop a hard pan within the phreatic surface of the tailings. What happened in 2002? We ended up with a disagreement with the government, my client and I, which was Talisman Energy, the processes, and we basically said, okay, we quit. So MNDM kept on sending me occasional monitoring data, and we left, and they were very nice. So we had started the project in 1986, and by 2002, we left the site unattended. Next slide. So again, Mike Sudbury evaluated the costs, what we would have saved, and you can see this is rather impressive. The summary slides are the cost implementing only Boomerang Lake full scale, but most other processes were only field piloted. That's why when I received the water quality data from 2 decades after we left in 2002, 2013 and 2015, I believe, when we left the site, I thought this would be a disaster now. But I must admit, maybe nature works as anticipated or even better, as our measures must have been sufficient to kickstart the ecological processes which we anticipated. But this I don't know. The green actions in the slide are what we did, the ecological ones, and it would make sense to go and check it. There are many tons of CPMW applied at the site, targeted to the sediment, the mill site, and to the tailings. The next slide. Well, and I said at the beginning, I had colleagues which helped to give a perspective. So we now turn to the next concern of the industry, reducing the waste usage of land and the wastewater consumption. Here, the hurdles are similar to the inhibition I hear from my colleague. It's necessary to maybe recall, to recall the quote of Einstein, because you can't take this, the same view in the way we produce the problems. Taking a different view, making a paradigm shift in the way we look at the recovery of metals, that is necessary. You can see with technologies developed by Neomet or NMR 330, the minerals are much more minerals could be extracted if we use chloride. And given that the mining of minerals is usually a major cost in the operation, Bryn suggested that merchants and Klingons and Cybermen, depending on your sci-fi favorite, would not understand why we spend so much money digging up the rocks out of Earth, only return much of it back, and to generate ourselves the need for more digging limestone deposits to neutralize the drainage. Looked at in the cold of day, it really doesn't make much sense. Next slide, please. And here are aluminum, iron, and silica mines would become smaller or not needed if we use this method. and if we increased recycling, where the industry has lots of capabilities of doing that. Here, with some hypothetical examples, I have highlighted the saviors or the differences. No, the first time I thought there was something wrong, but no, it's tons and kilograms, tons and kilograms. So I would say that this is a potential that a chloride-based, well, I'm no expert on that, but that a chloride-based approach makes sense. A successful mini plant piloting on both processes are being completed, and hopefully the engineering cost estimates will be carried out on those pilots. Next slide. I intentionally didn't put this slide of Mike Sudbury, who gave the perspective of global annual costs, which is important, how much the whole mining industry produces on waste rock and water usage. If I put that right at the beginning, maybe some of you would have figured, oh, here we go again, a tree hugger, and you could simply lock out. And that's what I didn't want you to do. What I really would like to do is that you look at the Oxford for the details and also the other industry figures. Clearly, the mining industry is not the biggest industry of using water, but if you look at the annual aspect, in 5 years, we would have covered Cape Breton Island or Prince Edward Islands, not Cape Breton Islands, but Cape Edward Islands. It was very difficult to find clever comparison, and that was basically the only one. Mining operations I found, the only one I found, mining operations produce really large volumes of water, contaminated, and create a lot of waste. One estimate puts that at 80 cubic kilometers, and the tonnage loading is at, I think, 20 tons per square meter. So 20 billion tons covering an area of 1,000 square kilometers. So we're coming close to an end, and I would like to reflect mining methods were developed in a world with unlimited resources. But now the industry is on collision course with a growing population, with its use of water, with the water shortages already apparent in many places of the world, and shortages in arable land to feed the growing population. We know, and you've heard that many times, the carrying capacity of the planet is exceeded several times. But maybe with ecological engineering and the chloride processing, that's one way to recover iron, etc., make smaller waste rock piles and reduce the tonnage of waste. Next slide. How many are still alive?
Here,
Bridget, for
this
you.
is Bridget. I will launch the poll question. Why is a paradigm shift needed in mine waste management? Climate change, more recycling, finite resources of water and arable land, and population growth. So we'll give people a few seconds to vote. And I think everyone has voted. So here we go. 97% said finite resources of water and arable land and population growth.
Well, this is really super great. The next slide, and that will be the last one. Well, oops. Oh, this is, you know, if you really when it really comes down to it, what is our tailings and waste rock. It's ground or broken rock. And that is making troubles when it's mistreated. Mistreatment means just putting a cover on it. It poses a risk and it uses resources. But if we treat it properly, it will become a resource. Somewhat it reminded me, if my husband treats me right, I'll be much nicer than with mistreated. These details, all the details, are in the Encyclopedia, with all the publication we have generated and about 178 documents describing either processes or decommissioning scenarios are in the Laurentian Library, also free, available for learning. So what needs to be done? It's a multidisciplinary learning effort, and then ecological engineering really becomes a piece of cake. And I think now we are down to the last slide. In closing, I would like to make one statement. I have learned over my 35 years in this non-business, I point out, I've noted more publications don't get the message out. I sure hope, and I would like to thank Bridget and Neolin from Berwick, that I'm really grateful for their help, for their comments, and I hope that while I'm still reasonably old, that means I'm not yet walking or I'm not yet sick, I can help transfer ecological know-how to the next generation and help achieve not all, but maybe some of the CIMIC's great goals. I heard yesterday in the webinar, not only collaboration will make this, but we need to go and look if that site is really doing as good as I suspect. But it could be, I know one place is definitely doing well. So thank you very much for listening. And now we have questions. But from the polls, I think I got my message across. To you, Bridget.
Thank you, Margarete. We are open for questions. If you do have a question, please can you type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, just a reminder that there are handouts available to complement Margarete's presentation, and you can access those through your control panel as well. So we have a couple of questions in already. Margarete,
yeah.
Are there any which cannot deal with using the ecological engineering approach?
Well, there are conditions. If a mine site is contaminated with mercury, it gets difficult because mercury has a very high component of volatilization. So that is truly difficult. If I understood the question correctly.
Okay. Another question. What are the reasons that arum is not as widespread as conventional remediation methods?
Oh, well, you see, why is arum not as widespread? Well, the problem is, one of the issues is that they want to replace a treatment plant with the high volumes. And this arum works in sediments and in not high speed, thousands and thousands of cubic meters of liters of water in a mine discharge. So arum is really a big part of smaller 1 liter a second in Brazil works perfectly and has worked since 1978. That's the slide that we skipped. So it really is for decommissioning conditions. But the high volumes, they have to be in an open pit. Then we build a sediment and then it works. But all of the methods have not been greatly greatly used because I get mistaken for cattail Kalin and doing wetlands, and I'm not doing wetlands. I'm working within the mining waste.
Okay, thank you. Another question. For gold mine waste, do cyanide compounds and cyanate impact bioremediation?
Oh no. In fact, I worked on red mud, and there are bacteria which degrade cyanide beautifully. You just have to promote them again. Same principle. Red mud, it was a bit touchy. That was very much in the beginning. I worked there with Alcan in Chicoutimi, and the cyanobacteria are called cyanobacteria because they are very much, some of them, some groups or some genders of them actually generate cyanide. So no problem.
Okay. Can you discuss the challenges of applying ecological engineering in the north and associated low temperatures?
Well, that is a great question because everyone thinks that life stops when it's cold and it's freezing. Sediments will never freeze, and I had exactly a contract from Diane, Department of Indian and Northern Affairs at that time, where I looked at the Nanisivik mine, and there was no problem. All of the drill holes, they were actually exothermic because that site very high pyrite content. So all the drill holes were making water in the middle of winter all the way through. And you know what happens is in the winter, the weathering rate, the contaminant generation is also not as fast. So it balances itself out, no problem. I also worked at Echo Bay. They told me, oh, you don't have to go outside. It's much too cold up here. There will be no running seeps from the dikes. Same thing I did in Whitehorse. There were running seeps. So they said, oh, and we snowshoed to the thing, duck deep. In one, well, it just, because the water, Elliott Lake, the water is so high in conductivity that it also lowers the freezing point. So don't worry about the north.
Well, I have just one last quick question. What is your opinion on the use of biocides in remediation?
Look, the sterilization methods which microbiologists work is high pressure, high everything. Basically, you can't kill bacteria or microbes. They will, under very harsh conditions, they encapsulate and go to sleep until conditions get better, or they make spores until conditions get better. The reason the bio-leach guys are sterilizing, they're only sterilizing because the one particular bug, they want to get the bio-leach going very, very quickly. And my microbiologists, I had 1, 2, 3 different stages. Well, 35 years is a long time. So we used ATP that should kill any cell metabolism. We were not successful. So that is, and actually there were people which were using CPMW together with biocides on red dog, but that red dog experiment was set up, completely in reducing conditions. So CPMW can only work if there's acids there. So, they used that together and the experiments failed. I would think I haven't seen any publication on a successful biocide application.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Margarete. We don't have time for any more questions, but I see there are some more that people have sent in. So I encourage you to please email Margarete directly. Her email address is on your screen. And
Yeah.
I'm sure she'll be quite happy to discuss further. So thank you,
Okay.
everybody, for
Well,
attending.
but you're sending it now, or they send it in the email, right?
We'll send it a little later. So thank you everybody for attending. This was the last in our current series of MetSoc environmental section webinars, and hopefully we'll continue the series in the new year. So you can also take a look at a recording of this webinar as well as the previous webinars on the metsoc.org website, and there you will find a link to go to the YouTube channel which has the recordings. Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to your feedback from a survey that we will send out, and enjoy the rest of the day.